Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Reline. This is episode 12, and today I am with Daniel Tutt. Daniel Tutt is the author of a really good book called How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. Welcome, Daniel. This is our second attempt at recording, but we'll pretend, hey, good to be here, right?
Cheers.
Cheers.
Happy holidays.
So I'm super curious. I'll tell the readers or tell the listeners a little bit about your book. The book is about Nietzsche, but not necessarily his ideas, but how his ideas relate to the left, specifically on the questions of class analysis, and also his larger political effects. So it's a deeply philosophical book, but it's also a deeply political book as well. So could you tell us why you wrote it?
Yeah, I wrote the book in part because I think the left has relied on a certain interpretation of Nietzsche for many decades now, largely in the post-World War II context, that I think has been quite limited. And by limited, what I mean is that Nietzsche's this sort of decontextualized ahistorical philosopher who is obviously one of the most widely read philosophers of all time, even on the left, right? So there are all different variations of Nietzscheanisms. But the left has incorporated Nietzsche in a kind of perfunctory way, in this decontextualized ahistorical way. And what the problem has been is that we've sort of missed out on the substantive political agenda that Nietzsche actually brings to the architecture of his ideas and concepts. And my argument is that when you do that, you actually miss the richness of the engagement that should be had with this thinker for the left, right? Because actually my claim would be that Nietzsche wanted his leftist readers to actually perceive him as an enemy. So Nietzsche has a type of inbuilt struggle that he's trying to wage with his readers, and furthermore, Nietzsche is actually more political even than Marx. Nietzsche is interested in great politics. Nietzsche is interested in silencing and obliterating certain forms of politics, which are politics born from socialism. Which is why a lot of left Nietzscheans have a fundamental hostility to organizational party, to proletarian consciousness often, although not always, but mostly, to socialism itself, right, to basic ideas of equality and things of this nature. So the Nietzschean leftism is, at face value, a type of hyper-militancy, very hyper, very, very seemingly radical, very seemingly accelerationist radical. So my argument is that the left actually has missed out on a type of praxis that I think is more, that Nietzsche has kind of perverted the leftist praxis in a lot of ways. That's a big claim which we can unpack. Obviously, as you know in the book, there's a huge autobiographical component going on here because
let's talk about that because
yeah.
and I had mentioned before we started recording that you write about Nietzsche as if you were a lover, not just someone who loved Nietzsche, but kind of like you're attempting to explain or understand your love of or your relationship with Nietzsche, especially since his ideas were incredibly transformative for you when you were younger. So you got to Nietzsche before you got to Marx, correct? Yeah.
I
So
did.
can you talk about your early relationship with him?
Yeah, definitely. Well, Nietzsche invites his readers to bring their own biographical experiences in the mode of being a philosopher, which is something great about Nietzsche, right? So this is why Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, calls Nietzsche an anti-philosopher, right? The skepticism that Nietzsche has towards things like the Kantian categorical imperative or the notion of universal morality and things like that, also implies, right, that philosophy should also be about this experiential dimension, about like one's lived experience, so to speak. Um, and so I think that for me, what was so attractive to Nietzsche as a young person was that we're given a quite libertine way of exit from repressive conditions, right? A kind of a philosophy that gives you the wings to escape your own repressive conditions, whatever those repressive conditions may be.
Hmm.
In that sense, Nietzsche is a kind of secular prophet, very close to, like, say, St. Paul. Those who do
Ah,
not follow
yes.
Christ, or rather, those who follow Christ must renounce their brother, their mother, their sister,
Mm.
their obligations, right? So Nietzsche, in the genealogy of morality, puts forward this argument that really, like, to be a philosopher is to flee from all obedience,
Mm.
right? To flee from all, authority and so on. So there's a certain way of reading Nietzsche like that. And I think that that was the way that I connected with him, because I was trying to flee conditions of basically like a broken family, um, labor situation, which was hopeless, working construction and landscaping, no way out, no escape.
Yeah.
So if I could sit down in this passionate engagement with this German philosopher who I knew very little about, I didn't read him as a political thinker. I read him as a spiritual thinker, right?
Mm.
So Nietzsche was a kind of souped up self help, right? A kind of rugged self help, and it worked. I mean, it helped me. It gave me courage. It gave me strength, right? Um, Over time, my relationship to philosophy changed, and I kind of wasn't as eager for thinking about philosophy as a mode of self help and pulling yourself out of repressive conditions. Things changed. I became more political. I began to read other thinkers, especially Marx and socialism. And then I went on to the kind of labor market in a post 2008 milieu context and experienced class issues, which were fairly pronounced, and it felt like the whole world had changed. And so I kind of document that journey, right, of a kind of depolitical or apolitical spiritual Nietzscheanism at a young age, um, a politicization that our generation, millennial generation, felt after the great economic crash of '08, and how that kind of sort of re-channeled the world, right? And then how I rediscovered Nietzsche. But I rediscovered Nietzsche through the lens of an often abandoned and often forgotten Marxist critique of him. And that critique is what my book is, like the center of my book. And sort of the proposal is to sort of reposition the way it's a book about reading methods. Here's a new reading method to get at Nietzsche, not as an ahistorical, decontextualized, merely spiritual philosopher. Now, of course, I say at the beginning, this is kind of bad news to any real lover of Nietzsche, because you run a risk, right? You run a risk, which is, or it's rather a question, which is, can the spiritual uplift still happen now that we have revealed the underbelly of political reaction that drives his thought?
Yeah. So
And that's a real question. That's a real
let's
question.
talk a little bit about so you talk about this kind of spiritual self discovery, this kind of you know I think for many people who, whether they're coming at it politically or not, there's a moment of, an escape, or there's a, hey, you can get out of your situation, or you can become something different. You can become almost like who you truly are, which you bring up in very early in the book, how, the entire self-discovery, self-transformation, self-betterment ethic, I think, in neoliberal capitalism, is really, at its heart, that's what Nietzsche is offering. What he's offering is for you to not necessarily rise above your material conditions, but to be more more singular, to be a better brand, as it were. Can you talk about how that branding, I guess, how you've sort of seen that throughout liberalism throughout capitalism? Because that's an important critique you make, that Nietzsche
Yeah.
is basically the philosopher of liberal capitalism, even though we wouldn't necessarily expect him to
Right.
be described that way.
Yes. Well, Slavoj Žižek famously thinks that Spinoza is the philosopher of neoliberal capitalism. And by neoliberal capitalism, all we mean is like this certain paradoxical shift that happens in capitalism, right? Which is like, say, when the leftist students revolted in May '68, they revolted against the fact of the authoritarian family and these kind of imposed bourgeois rigidities and so on. Well, the system has absorbed those authoritarian rigidities and transcended them, right? And so we're in a kind of liberated capitalist, hedonistic scenario in which the highest calling, right, that we all must adhere to is to have the kind of most non-contradictory brand, right? To sort of follow commodification all the way, right? And to realize yourself in that way without is where the entrepreneurial thing comes in. And this is where Nietzsche's notion, which I mentioned before, of his community building calling is one of avoidance of all dependencies, right? Avoidance of all collective responsibilities,
Do you
right?
do
So
you
it's
mind if I
kind of
interrupt you just briefly,
sure.
since the listeners won't know this unless they've read your book? It's a very important point about the way that Nietzsche is completely attempting to draw the reader in, and you call this a community building project, where he's creating a community through his writing, that you are immediately a part of, or you are part of that community once you started reading it. It's hey, you're the elect because you have started reading me. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. Well, you see, part of this is where the historical context becomes so important. Nietzsche is a philosopher of vitalism, of life, of affirmation. And Nietzsche, as a young man, was conscripted in the military to fight the Franco-Prussian War, which was in part a kind of scenario that was a response to the communist uprising on the streets of Paris. And part of what Nietzsche saw around him in the Germany of his time after 1848, the most seismic worker uprising, and then the Paris Commune, was, of course, the existence of all of these different socialist parties. The enfranchisement of the universal male suffrage was happening. Of course, Nietzsche was sort of paranoid of these things. In part, he was paranoid about them because they represented, in his view, not merely a threat to his privilege and class position and things of that nature. No, they represent and constituted a threat to the very foundation of Western civilization, especially Western culture. And so Nietzsche concocts the genealogical method as an argument that these socialist and egalitarian movements, opened by the French Revolution, opened by the philosophy of Rousseau, in fact have a historical precedent, right, that stretches back to Socratism, to Judaism, Christianity. So he creates a whole genealogy of these in his eyes, they're all stemming from a philosophy of resentment, right? So the kind of egalitarian impulses around him, he perceives as resentful philosophies, and so he starts to experiment with this idea of creating a calling forth a new community, what he calls a negative community, what he calls the party of life. The party of life is an early concept that he'll develop around this, which is what? Which is calling forth a certain type of intellectual, inventing a certain type of intellectual, which will be different than the Rousseauist and the socialist, egalitarian, universalist intellectual, and the working class intellectual, who he calls as moral tarantulas and moral spiders and so on. So you see Nietzsche's creating an alternative community that he's trying to invent to preserve a particular form of bourgeois private individualism, which he sees as coming under assault. And he experiments with different strategies of what to name this community. One strategy is the free spirits. And you probably know if you read Nietzsche that he's constantly invoking this notion of the free spirits. Well, what is the free spirits? Well, historically, the free spirits is an idea that he had, which was in distinction, a form of followers, which would be different than the free thinkers. Because you see, the proposition of Socrates that universal goodness or virtue can be taught to all was represented for Nietzsche a certain assault on the direction of bourgeois civilizational project itself. So Nietzsche develops a kind of dialectic with egalitarian and socialist movements of his time. And if you don't read him in that tension with those movements, and you prefer to read him as apolitical and detethered from them, a lot of his stuff doesn't really make sense. And so, yes, to answer your question, there's a community building, explicit community building thing going on. Now, the argument as to how all of that is compatible with our current iteration of capitalism is an interesting argument. The argument is that, like Zizek once said, that Spinoza is the most compatible with neoliberalism. And by that he meant that Spinozism is capable of creating a philosophy in which there's a kind of unitary cosmopolitan liberal subject as the highest achievement of what is possible. And that any kind of adversarial contestation of that singular agent is not capable. And then furthermore, all of the contradictions of our system, and this is, of course, a lot of Spinozist, especially Spinozist leftists, hate Zizek for this claim. But what I'm trying to say is something similar, but I'm actually saying, well, it's not really Spinoza whose philosophy is emblematic of our time. It's really more Nietzsche, in the sense that Nietzsche calls for his reader to kind of transcend the contradictions of the class struggle, to transcend the contradictions of capitalism, and to realize yourself outside of them. This is why Nietzsche is actually best understood as a kind of romantic anti-capitalist. It's quite of a paradox.
Yeah,
and of course,
and
you have to then
you use that.
You have to then
You use
further
that phrase
say
of-
is that. Yeah, go ahead.
I
Well, I was
just
going to
gonna,
say it's very important to define that, because that means that the
Yeah.
ruling class. This is a key point that I think maybe is counterintuitive, which is that, and it's something I get from Georg Lukács, the great Marxist philosopher, which is that the ruling class, at about the time of the post-Paris Commune scenario, when imperialism really takes off, all of the events that would lead up to the First World War, the land grabs, the colonialism, the expansion. Well, what happened at that moment was the bourgeoisie, right, the ruling class in Europe, began to experiment with a kind of distance and critique of capitalism itself. And what happened was an ideological, it's quite potent if you think about it. Imagine a ruling class that disavows their own commitment in the very project that sustains their sustenance and existence. That's Nietzscheanism, right? So it's a kind of deceitful critique of the bourgeoisie, right, itself. And that's Nietzscheanism, right? But the other side, and this is why I think Nietzscheanism speaks more to our present, is how do you maintain the ideology of singular brand realization and hyper-individualism, right? Where you kind of naturalize the market as the arbiter of all of that, right? Of that process of self-realization. But then on the other side, how do you justify the fact that class domination, austerity, and the kind of punishment of people through either incarceration, through hunger, through homelessness, through all of the horrors of our society, how do you justify those horrors as natural?
Oh, yeah.
And here I argue that Nietzsche in himself has a kind of naturalist metaphysics of capitalism that kind of tries to take the brutalities of capitalism and render them as most natural. And this is why actually this is the esoteric side of Nietzsche, actually what I say, in the sense that what Nietzsche is also trying to prepare his followers for is the naturalization of a world of rank, order, and brutalism. And that part of the problem with socialists is the idea that they falsely flee from a brutal world. But the world is brutal and it has to be faced as such, right? So at face value, you have to return Nietzsche always to his polemic with the left to understand him, right? This is part of my wider argument is that the left hasn't really been dealing with the accurate Nietzsche in their confrontation with him.
If we could talk a bit about that, so you mention Bonapartism,
Yeah.
and this is a very interesting theory because when I first got into Marxism, like I started out in anarchism, read Deleuze, and that whole kind of that movement, I guess, and then I started reading Zizek, and I was like, oh wait, actually that kind of makes sense. That makes more sense. Which, speaking of which, Zizek has an endorsement on your book, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
he
that's
apparently
awesome.
liked it.
That's so
Yeah,
cool. So you bring up the point of Bonapartism, where
yes,
Nietzsche is ultimately a Bonapartist, which I'll ask you to define that in a moment, but I'll tell you my understanding of it. It's that when the liberal order or the bourgeois order is starting to become overwhelmed with its own contradictions, it kind of summons forth, which this is also a theory on fascism as well, that this is what was first explained to me as what fascism is. It's kind of a emergency switch for the liberal capitalist order, where everything is, the contradictions keep building up, where supposedly everybody is equal because, democracy or whatever, and yet no one is economically equal and don't even have the same economic opportunities. I have all of these contradictions continuously build up, and then there's a point where the system is in crisis itself, and it essentially summons forth a figure that kind of wrecks everything for a little bit, and then ends up reestablishing the order again. So Napoleon would be one of those people. You bring up Bismarck as well, and then technically also Trump would be a Bonapartist figure, as opposed to a fascist figure, which is what you saw very often him described as in the United States. It's like, oh, he's fascism. We're saying, well, no, actually, this is capitalism's emergency switch right here. So can you talk about can you talk more about Bonapartism, and then also Nietzsche's reaction to the egalitarian movement and his preference for this Bonapartist figure?
yes, very good. Yes, so Bonapartism obviously comes as a concept, other than sort of the empirical historical fact of Napoleon Bonaparte's ascendancy after the French Revolution, which we know was the implementation of a kind of state of exception based on military might, which also represented, of course, the blocking of the process that the Jacobins opened of the continuation of a revolutionary sequence. Napoleon came to stop that, and then in so doing, he redefines the relationship between the demands of representative democracy and the state, and the state then takes on. So it's a Marxist theory of the state in some sense, because you see, it's also a theory of repetition in capitalist social orders. That's Marx's whole idea in his famous text, The 18th of Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, who was a distant cousin of Napoleon, who came to power after 1848, and so in France. And the idea there was that a Bonapartist it performs a certain obliteration of the clarity of the class struggle by uniting certain forces within the class arrangement in society in such a way that the Bonapartist obscures, this is their function, is to obscure and reroute social antagonisms away from crisis. So it's also a kind of crisis management device. And so we see two forms of Bonapartism emerge, soft and hard. A soft Bonapartist you could call someone like FDR in the United States. So FDR comes about as a class compromise to save capitalism from its own crisis. Of course, FDR represented American aristocracy with the socialist and workers' movement. Right? In an interesting way, Louis Bonaparte also represents the unification of contradictory class interests. He's for the aristocracy, he's for the lumpenproletariat, right? And he makes a pact with the petty bourgeoisie. So a Bonapartist figure can also be a hard Bonapartist figure. Right? And what does that represent? That would represent something kind of like Trumpism, perhaps, which is a kind of pre-dictatorial but not fascist emergence of a leader who is denied by the entirety of the ruling class, but the ruling class ideologically is forced to support him because he satiates the discontents of the working class itself. And so you have a maddening situation on your hand with Bonapartism, right? Which is, it allows for the continuation of the tyranny of bourgeois private property and the expansion of capitalism as such in structural form. But it sort of resolves those contradictions at the level of what Marx and Engels calls the superstructure. So it's a kind of cultural rerouting of those antagonisms. And now Nietzsche liked Bonapartism. I mean, first of all, he had positive things to say both about Napoleon and the later Napoleon who came to power after 1848, in the way in which they preserved something of the aristocratic distinction that the capitalist system always has embedded within it. They kept at bay these egalitarian maniacs in Nietzsche's eyes. They kept them at bay, and they didn't empower them, right? To empower them would represent a contamination of the whole social order and risk the collapse of. So you can almost read Nietzsche as a kind of paranoid bourgeois thinker, in some sense. Paranoid of the class struggle becoming palpable, becoming legible. And that's Nietzscheanism. It's always interested in this rerouting of social antagonism, which is why I call Nietzsche a great nominalist. He's a nominalist in philosophy, which means that for him, the truths that socialists are identifying about social conflicts and so on really have to be kind of, sidelined and made out to be ludicrous. Anyways, I hope that gives a decent sense of what Bonapartism is. Part of my interest in this is that, of course, a lot of Marxists in the 1970s put forward arguments that Bonapartism is kind of no longer applicable. And I'm arguing that that in fact it is, and that in fact it still gives us a way to understand, say, all the far-right populisms that are happening today.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing, I think that was incredibly clear in your book, that you explained very well what Bonapartism is, why it matters, and why it is important to understand that the importance of it to Nietzsche, that he's in constant debate or constantly contesting this egalitarian urge, which, of course, you note within the bourgeois revolution, of France, like the full equality was never realized, and this hope or this dream, the socialist dream of actually having full equality, is constantly suppressed by the bourgeois order, which actually claims that no, we got rid of the aristocracy, we're all equals now, but there's always one sphere where you cannot be equal, which is on the economic. And none of this is clear if you are reading Nietzsche from, I guess the phrase is hermeneutics of innocence, like taking him as kind of an eternal figure who is apolitical, lifting him out of his own historical period, and not seeing any relevance in that at all. So I feel like you bring that incredibly cool. Like, that was the point at which I felt very convinced in your book. Like, okay, I see that. But one thing I'd like to move on to the way that the left or leftists or in general how there's been this response to Nietzsche where there have been some, you point out very powerful uses of his ideas. So you want to talk about that? I mean, you mentioned of course Deleuze, which that's a really really large one, but you also mentioned Jack London, which is something that I had not realized.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reading the book so carefully. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, it's a great book. It's a great book, and it's very. I absolutely recommend it. And just to be clear, like I never went to university, so I don't have any of the university training or anything else like that. And while your book is written from a very deep academic philosophical perspective, it is incredibly readable for somebody who doesn't have that formal training. So anybody who's listening to this who's thinking, yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a bit hard. Like, no, actually, it is a fascinating read.
Yeah.
And you also do this thing that Zizek does, which I've noticed, which I can tell he's probably kind of one of your heroes, where there's a point at which when you're reading something that Zizek has written, that once you really understand what he just said, you feel like you just won. You feel like you just like won a contest or something. And there's something, you do the same thing in your writing where you kind of like bring the reader on, and then suddenly there's this moment where, then you give them the prize, and it's great. So anyway, I'm sorry about that divergence, but I really appreciated it.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, I mean,
But the
it's
question
funny
was
you
the
mentioned-
left.
Yeah. So let's talk about Jack London as an example. So London, was an autodidact, working class writer, and I went and I dug into his biography really deeply to write that section, because a lot of folks on the left really consider Jack London to be an outdated kind of figure, and that a lot of folks consider his politics to be antiquated. And I think that there's some truth in that, but there's also a certain relevance of Jack London, in fact. And what I try to show is that London was a kind of Marxist Nietzschean. And so the first interesting point there is like, well, what kind of Nietzschean Marxist was he? And what I think is essential to understand here is that the way that London was absorbing Nietzsche was before all of these watered-down translations that portray Nietzsche as apolitical. No, London was reading Nietzsche as a kind of undiluted, aristocratic figure who was sort of, for eugenics and for the annihilation of the working class and all of that. So that was never ambiguous for London. Rather, London saw a brilliant enemy who literally had to be fought, and that he wanted to galvanize a type of inverted Nietzscheanism for proletarian liberation. Now, here's the crazy thing. The founder of the Black Panthers...
Can I bring up one thing just
Go ahead.
That you point out in the book, which was completely... It didn't make any sense to me, but then realizing just all of the people that I personally know who were really into Nietzsche, like you point out that at least in Germany, like, there was a survey of workers, and that like Nietzsche was incredibly popular among the working class, despite the fact that, the distillation of Nietzsche's ideas are that like, hey, you should enjoy your suffering, basically. Nothing is going to change. Don't try to be egalitarian. But so that puts London's idea that this is an important enemy to fight into context, where London would also have known, like, as an organizer himself, he would have seen all of these working class people being really into Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. So like people used to read Nietzsche through this class lens. That's the key point. And we've kind of forgotten how to do that. And my book is trying to say, let's remember. Because if you see, the point is the left can kind of benefit from Nietzsche when you read him as a parasite, when you read him parasitically. And I make a distinction there between reading him as a parasite and what I call elective affinity, which is this decontextualized, apolitical version of Nietzsche, which sort of saps the substance from him. And then they even further would say, well, don't even make him an enemy, because to do that would be unrefined or vulgar to call him an enemy. And
Sorry
my
to interrupt
position
you
on that
again.
is,
I
please,
just think this would help again the listeners and watchers or viewers.
please.
By elective affinity, you use the example of kind of an alchemical example where, it's let's take these two together as equals without their specific context, and let's try to create something new from it. And you even mentioned, I think, the example of lining them up and attempting to line them up, but the problem is like they cannot be lined up correctly without kind of ignoring what they were actually for. So that's a really important point in your book.
It is important. I mean, it's so essential, because if you if you take the two as these kind of compatible substances, Marx and Nietzsche were talking about, you can see, well, you can kind of make a kind of perfunctory fit, and you can kind of create a kind of, I don't know, like a kind of, you can create a kind of a motorcycle of theory for the left that's made of spare parts. But my argument is that that motorcycle that you're constructing isn't going to last, because the parts that you've constructed it on are highly contradictory to one another. So, for example, Marx and Nietzsche both write about the Paris Commune as as a type of slave revolt. But the distinction there that's so often missed by leftists is the fact that there's no commentary regarding the prescription of what Nietzsche thinks about those slaves that revolted. There's no commentary about that. They just simply trust his conception of slave morality as applicable to the working class at the time. And they try to make a homology, a neat comparison between that and Marx's comments, when in fact they could not be more different, especially when we understand what Nietzsche desired about slavery and the working class and so on. So why are those things not discussed? That's a repressive mode of reading, right? That's what I call elective affinity. That's one example. There's many examples, though, right? Because both thinkers have critiques of, let's say, bourgeois morality, right? And so you go down this rabbit hole and you construct this motorcycle. And what I worry is that from a theoretical, intellectual standpoint, what you're constructing becomes a kind of weird, repressed, and contradictory machine. And that's kind of why I have a skepticism about Nietzschean Marxism. On the other hand, and here it goes back to what I was just about to say. So we have Jack London, and he creates not a Nietzschean Marxism, but he creates a kind of parasitical way to read Nietzsche as a socialist. He's not the only one to do that, by the way, because the next chapter, as you remember, is about the founder of the Black Panthers. And lo and behold, Huey Newton did the same thing as Jack London. And one of my friends was reading the book, and he's like, why does so many leftists see Jack London and Huey Newton as somehow radically adversarial to one another? That's actually part of my argument, which is actually, you know what, maybe they're not, right? And then I get into what Nietzsche said about race and racism, which I think is very interesting, and another reason why Nietzsche is one of our contemporaries, because Nietzsche has a theory of racism and racial difference, which I argue is almost prophetic to how racial difference works today. That's a whole other point. But to go back to Jack London, he read Nietzsche differently. He read Nietzsche as a antagonist to the goals of the left. But you know what he gained? Here's what he gained. And this is a kind of interesting point, I think. And this is where this is why Nietzsche must be read. Because I would never accept this liberal idea that, we should cancel him because he's reactionary. No. He must be read because London discovered something super essential, which is how do you take a collective that is passive in the face of their oppression? That's exactly the condition that both Huey Newton and Jack London found the proletariat to be in. So when you fight Nietzsche at that level, he brings something out of you. Now, the argument that Kurt Eisner makes, who's another one of these parasitical readers of Nietzsche, in like 1918, around that period, he led the Bavarian Socialist Revolution. And he wrote a book about Nietzsche and Marx, which was not for this perfunctory fusion between the two. No, it was a parasitical reading because it was called spiritual psychopathy, and his argument was basically that the proletariat needs to undergo a phase of realizing its own aristocratic overman potential in order to overthrow the aristocracy. In other words, we need Nietzsche to overthrow the remnants of aristocratic rule, which still, obviously, in like 1917 in Bolshevism, they were really throwing over bourgeoisie, but the aristocracy. So Nietzsche as an aristocratic figure was used in those contexts to transcend bourgeoisie, in some sense. So that's a very interesting insight, which is you can kind of use Nietzsche as a kind of subterfuge against his project. You can flip his project on its head in some sense, right? And so that to me is where Nietzsche's probably his most value comes in, is in that idea.
Yeah, I always and actually I'd like to skip to the section that I think was the most interesting for me, but also the one that I actually had a little bit of disagreement with you on this one, which is when you talk about ressentiment. So the concept of ressentiment predates Nietzsche, and it's been used by many other people as well, but it's not the same as resentment. And this is something I use this in my book, Here Be Monsters, to kind of talk about the loss of agency of the working class. So, for Nietzsche, it's a slightly different concept, but and so maybe this is a parasitical reading of his idea. But what happens in the state of ressentiment, as far as I understand it, is that we abdicate to others or to a system or to a amorphous thing, an amorphous enemy, our own agency. So you see this. It's easiest to see, I think, in far right or like racist movements or anti-Semitism. For example, the person who believes that Jews are in control of the world and that's why they can't get a job, has put themselves into a state of ressentiment, which is really they've abdicated their own agency and they've created a big other that is the problem, that is the cause of all of their suffering. So for me, I've always seen it as a important, and I'll admit, like it was a massively transformative idea for me because it helped me work through my own feelings that there was nothing that could change because there was always someone else who was causing the problems, creating all of the obstacles in my life. And so for, like Marx's idea, I felt, was to remind the working class that, hey, actually, not only are you doing all of the work in the world and creating all of the value, you literally are making this. Everything is built upon you. You're the one with the agency here, and that agency is constantly being taken away from you. And there's a way in which you can read Nietzsche in his concept of resentment as kind of the same thing, even though that was obviously not his intention. His intention was not to teach the workers that, hey, you actually should be, there should be a new aristocracy of the working class. Like he wasn't trying to do that at all. But and anyway, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. But can you talk about why you are reluctant or why you don't think we should be using the idea of ressentiment so much on the left?
Sure. Well, because politics is about the venting of complaint and resentments, and that's valid. There's a lot of things to be resentful for, and part of my problem is what ends up happening, I think, is that Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, because it has such a explicit claim about the status of a particular form of intractable envy. Primarily for Nietzsche, it is a form of envy. Envy over injustices as born from class struggle. So, in that way, if you buy into Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, you've bought into this metaphysics about its cause as born from injustices from the market and from capitalist social relations. And therefore, when you then apply it to another group or another individual, what you've done is you've shut down that group or that individual's capacity for a venting of their otherwise valid resentments. You have arrogated a moral authority onto yourself to say that those resentments are valid and these ones are not. So it becomes arbitrary. It becomes arbitrary, and in a paradoxical sense, and this will bother Nietzscheans, it becomes highly moralistic. And I give the example of a lot of Nietzscheans who try to make the claim that there's something like, say, in America, in a post-World War II context, of this resentment from the white working class over the loss of their privilege. And I find that claim anti-materialist and ahistorical and superficially racialized, right? And what the effect of that is, this is one example, there's others, is to shut down any solidarity with groups from that class and to shut down any conversation regarding exploitation as born from material relations of production and exploitation and so on. So you see, that's how Nietzsche's concept comes back to mute the class struggle, right? So when you use ressentiment as Nietzsche wished, even when you're not aware, you've basically shut down conversations at this level of exploitation. That's a
So
problem, I think. It's a problem for socialism.
in a way, it's the problem you see is that people use it as a, oh, you're just bitter because you lost.
Exactly.
That,
It fits into the liberal Nietzschean notion of and you probably remember, of what we can basically diagnose as a kind of sadomasochistic social vision, right? And this is a kind of standard trope, unfortunately, of liberalism, which is liberals think about class through the lens of winners and losers, because they have already argued that from a legal point of view, right, each agent is equal. Like, it's the same thing with liberals. Like, why can't a liberal think about the cause of the Palestinians prior to October 7th? Well, because they've internalized bourgeois equality. It's not the equality of Marx. It's not the equality of socialism. But you see, a Nietzschean would say, oh, well, we must abolish all forms of equality. No, no, right? No, this is the issue, is this. Now, here's the caveat, which is a lot of left Nietzscheans don't necessarily ascribe to the sadomasochistic vision of a society built on winners and losers. Some do. So, but when you do, it's quite easy to parse out who is of ressentiment and who's not, right? The market produces people of ressentiment, right? And this, I think, it's obvious why this should be avoided, but for others, it's not so obvious. So I just wanted to sort of make it clear that in my vision, the left really has to reject this metaphysics of winners and losers.
it's almost like a naturalization of ressentiment. I mean, and you bring up that the way that ressentiment functions in these discussions is as if it is a permanent state.
Yeah.
Which and I think if you look at its equivalence in psychology, you see that it's never a permanent state, and that the goal of the psychoanalyst, and you mentioned Lacan too. I don't know if we'll have enough time to get into it, but
Sure.
the goal of the psychoanalyst is to help the person see how you can act too, and in fact to kind of return to that agency so that you're no longer stuck in that what is just a temporary state anyway.
Yeah.
If you could hold on 1 second, I need to
Sure, please.
plug in my computer because it's just told me that it's dying. So as I was saying, the helping to restore the agency of people, or to show or to situate ressentiment as something that is a temporary state that people get into. That is completely different, I think, than the way that it is naturalized. And you talk about naturalization a lot throughout your book, just the way that the liberal bourgeois order is constantly naturalizing the rank order that you talk about. Like, it's naturalizing inequality by
Right.
kind of putting the onus onto people like, well, it's a meritocracy, so if you're not doing well, then it's your fault.
Absolutely.
Which and that's always been, especially in American capitalism or American liberal capitalism, that's always been the retort. Like, well, have you tried working harder? you know, so I do really appreciate your, even if I'm not 100% in agreement with it, I'm probably 98% in agreement with it. That for the most part, at least when we're talking about groups, what happens is when we talk about resentment or ressentiment, we're just naturalizing a situation where it's like, well, yeah, they're always going to be like that. They're never going to be happy.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually why I try to show from some sociological and ethnographic work that, like, let's take the contemporary working class. And I'm not trying to make an argument that the contemporary working class is, transcended ressentiment. But as Nietzsche defines ressentiment, as this kind of sort of sunk confluence of affects that overwhelm the subject and lead to bad conscience, I actually perceive through some examples that I've been working on, because another book that I wrote was on the family, and I do a lot of sociological work on like the status of working class politics today. And I really think, and I get this from Max Scheller's book on ressentiment, where he makes the nice point that in modern capitalism, the class that is most, and this might actually interestingly connect to Dan Evans's work, that is most prone to something like ressentiment is the petit bourgeois class, and because of their contradictory class position, in the sense you could even see exactly why. Like they're the least happy to be in their place and the most prone to envious relationality.
And they're the ones who adopt most. I mean, very similar to the reading of the professional managerial class. They're the ones who adopt most the ethic of the ruling bourgeoisie class, but actually are still not in the material conditions of that. And so their tension, their conflict with them is always going to be like, well, why am I not like you? And then they're going to kind of push back at any attempts at equality from below, because then
Right.
they're also, that leads them to go down even further. Yeah.
Exactly. So in a sense, my diagnosis. You see, a lot of left Nietzscheans will assign this based on models similar to how Nietzsche assigned it, which is largely to the kind of working class as such, and it becomes quite essentialized and problematic when that happens. But what I think, and I get this from like people like Huey Newton and Jack London, what I think actually is a better way to assign the question of resentment for the working class is not that they have a debilitating ressentiment that prevents them from rational engagement in politics and so on. No, it's actually an issue of passivity. It's an issue of not having the resolve to fight the system. And I think that there's something that I found buried within the Nietzschean corpus that helps me see that condition. And I think that is true empirically, and that a task, maybe we could say, of the left is to give people the resolve to fight the system. Then, of course, the question is, okay, on what basis are we fighting the system, and what's our prescription for radicalism? That's the kind of praxis question, which I then would furthermore argue that Nietzsche gives us a praxis which is problematic, which I talk about, but still, nonetheless, he opens this problem of passivity. And I think that, what does that mean? Well, it means that the working class has, in many cases, not always, internalized this society as a natural reflection of how things are. And, I think that this is something that plagues working class consciousness building, proletarian consciousness building. We have to sort of alarm people to the machinations of the system, not by personalizing the system, but by revealing, as Marx did, this kind of rational kernel of its impersonal domination over us. So I think this is sort of what you're saying. But as I understand, Reed, your problem with ressentiment is that you have felt and seen let's say, this confluence of affects of ressentiment in your life and experience, and you think that it is a valid psychological condition that Nietzsche diagnoses, and that my treatment of it, maybe to summarize, maybe runs the risk of discarding his insights there. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that would be a bit, but also I feel like it's more of a challenge to, there are other ways of describing it. Like in my book, I bring up the relationship between, this concept of ressentiment and the rather ancient concept and very, pretty much global concept of the evil eye. The idea of bitterness or envy or the sense that you have been harmed, and this is so. And I really like how you're quite critical of Deleuze's influence on the left, and so am I actually. But I did like the way that Deleuze explained ressentiment. By
Okay.
bringing up the idea of the trace, that there's that there's this experience of trauma that we all kind of have, whether or not anybody actually did anything to us. There's still it there, imagined or real, and if we don't find a way to deal with that, to overcome it or to transform it, it can fester into a point where we lose our agency. We lose our ability to understand how we actually can change our material conditions. And I think that's the important thing, because nobody talks about material conditions anymore. And I don't mean nobody, but you've noticed that the focus on material conditions is very very
Yeah.
squashed or quashed down, like within the left, and instead we talk about social conditions. But in the end, it's like, hey, I would like better material conditions. How do I do that? Well, I
Well,
can't do it
I
on my
think
own. I have to organize, etc. Anyway, go ahead.
I hear you. I hear you, and I think that's interesting. Here's my problem with the ressentiment way that Nietzsche brings it into the left, is that the community building project, like Deleuze says in his book Logic of Sense, he sort of splits the world in two, like Nietzsche does. And he says there's the men of ressentiment, which is a kind of vast majority of the masses, and there's the overmen who have transcended it. And so he sets a super high bar for overcoming resentments as the precondition of what it means to be a liberated, libertine leftist. So immediately you see the importation of a type of, unbeknownst to Deleuze, that's kind of an elitist structure. Like, do we need to liberate the working class by ensuring that they've all transcended their resentments? I don't think that's possible or advisable, right? If you are from a community where you've seen people in poverty, those resentments will not just somehow transcend by going off and having an ascetic experience in nature and doing yoga and reading and so on. That is not the basis by which we should advocate for the emancipation of the workers. But I feel that left Nietzscheanism kind of smuggles that conception back in and becomes super hard to do anything.
I think you're right, and
So
actually,
go
maybe the
ahead.
core there, maybe the core difference within my idea or my perception of it, I actually think ressentiment is a very rare condition, as opposed to being the default state of the lower classes or what have you. That it's a personal, social, psychosocial like situation that you get yourself into where you feel like your agency has been taken away, and but we're talking a lot about me here, and that's not necessary.
I
But
think that's fair.
the larger,
I kind of agree.
yeah,
But I
and
kind of agree with you, right?
okay,
I agree that it is. What I'm trying to say in that chapter is I'm trying to throw into suspicion the mere notion of it as an efficacious concept. Because when we take it literally, when we absorb it, we then apply it, often arbitrarily. And when we apply it, that's when I have a problem. Because we have shut down that individual or group from overcoming their condition. That I think is not advisable in politics.
and maybe a
It's an issue of solidarity.
a less philosophical and less political way of describing the reactionary. It's like, oh, they're just bitter, you know.
Well, look, I mean,
Yeah.
it's similar to this. Like, okay, so I'm from a family that ideologically, a lot of folks on the left would call like reactionaries because they're very conservative people. And so part of my existence on the left has been the idea that, yeah, there are reactionary people that we have to work with and through and contest. When you bring this kind of notion of ressentiment and all of its conceptions, psychological, metaphysical, and so on, you have created a barrier about the possible changing of reactionary people. That, to me, cannot happen on the left. Now, I know it's delicate and we have to fight carefully with reactionary forces and so on. But what I'm trying to avoid is this shutting down, this creating a wall, creating a barrier to the transformation of people. That's what I'm opposed to.
I like that. That's really good. So we're running out of time here, but one thing I really wanted to talk to you about, which I thought was really helpful as well, was your discussion about religion and comparing the way that Nietzsche and Marx see Christianity and what each of them believes was good and should be preserved within Christianity. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, a lot of readings of Nietzsche would have it that Nietzsche is a strident critic of all forms of Christianity. And I try to show that actually, according to the record of his own writings, and even his epistolary writings, letters, notes, correspondence with colleagues, is that Nietzsche actually admired certain aspects of Christianity, in fact. And what he admired the most about Christianity as an institution was its capacity for rank order, for the instantiation of a certain repression within people that led to their, in his eyes, their greatness, and so on. But for example, he loved Blaise Pascal. And Pascal, of course, as you probably know, was a member of a very, very conservative Catholic movement, Jansenism. And Nietzsche once said, "Why do you think that Pascal's face is so beautiful? It is because he has internalized the brutality of the Christian system so deeply." So there's a particular argument about genius and suffering. We haven't talked about suffering, but this is a huge motif in Nietzsche. Nietzsche brings the concept of suffering into the center of politics, and that's something, by the way, which we didn't mention apropos ressentiment, which we should have. Because you see, what Nietzsche is trying to say is that his followers need to understand that there's a hierarchy of suffering. And so the lower forms of suffering as born from labor, wage labor, what needs to happen is a philosophy, a social philosophy, in which those forms of suffering are internalized by the sufferers as, that they are comfortable and at ease with that. Which is why ultimately Nietzsche is for a social order that is very much intact and stable, right? And his problem with socialists is that he's saying, no. The socialists are saying to the workers that you shouldn't be happy in this condition. And Nietzsche is saying, why are you saying that? Actually, they should. Anyways, I'm digressing. But you see, the problem is for Marx, Christianity as an opium of the masses is a kind of partial universal. It's a kind of incomplete universal. It's not to say that Marx is trying to say that the very metaphysical status of the universal presuppositions of Christianity are themselves the problem. That would be what Nietzsche would say. What my argument is that Marx looks at it a little more dialectically, which is and I have quotes to back this up, what actually Christianity represents is a masked political, social universalism that is incomplete, and that the task of communist politics would be to bring it more to a state of completion. So Marx is not to be understood as a radically vulgar, anti-religious thinker in that way, and neither is Nietzsche. You see the point? I think that would be the way to say it.
Yeah, and I think you summarize it pretty well in the book, where you point out that what was important for Marx within the Christian legacy was this egalitarianism, which of course you see, in the writings of the early church, but also the sense of the universal brotherhood, as it were. Whereas for Nietzsche, Nietzsche saw what was important was its ability to maintain almost to maintain the great chain of being, the ordering of suffering, etc.
But he actually uses he swaps out Plato's notion of the great chain of being with the great chain of pain.
Yeah.
He doesn't use the word being. He doesn't use the word being because you see the socialist and the Socratic egalitarians are going to rely on this abstract category of being. But for Nietzsche, that actually doesn't mean anything in some sense, right? So we need to return to the physiological in all things. And that's another thing we didn't mention here, which is that the metric of Nietzsche's philosophy and his critique of slave morality is ultimately a critique over and around a conception of the human being as a physiological construct. And that sort of modernity, right, and the egalitarian movements don't understand how to order human relations in proper rank order vis-a-vis physiology. And that is why right-wing Nietzscheans love IQ and are for eugenics, right? And I think as socialists, this is where I would make my big defense for the rationalist tradition, for reason being the arbiter here. I do not want to see a social order in which biological determinisms are the basis of the distribution of resources and equality. To me, that's a disastrous and monstrous proposition. But the Nietzschean community, really will often fall back on that. And I think it's problematic.
And so if we can, I guess we'll end it here, but what I want to do is discuss your ultimate conclusion, which is, you say several times in the book, no, we should not cancel Nietzsche. And at least one of the reasons for not canceling Nietzsche is, canceling anybody gives them power. Like, hey, your ideas are so bad, so evil that we have to burn your books, etc. But your approach and your suggested approach, again, is not completely getting rid of him, nor is it trying to do that alchemical elective affinity where we strip each of them of everything except for their true substance and try to mix them together and create something new.
Right.
Instead, you bring up repeatedly this idea, which is an idea from Nietzsche himself. It's just like we need to parasitize. We need to be parasites of the body of Nietzsche, or the ideological or philosophical body of Nietzsche. And I want to read a quote in which you discuss this. This is right towards the end of the book. Our proposal is as follows. If Nietzsche is again inescapable, we do not aim for his cancellation, as that would only strengthen his cause. Our aim is to enter the community as fugitives, unwelcome, at a lower rank than we are, with the intention to completely work through him. As parasites, this is our mantra, not out but through. There is a double parasitical exchange at work here. We ingest the parasite Nietzsche just as he ingests us as we work through and sweat him out. We aim to burrow into Nietzsche as parasites and use his insights against him. That's the only way we can escape. I loved that paragraph, by the way. That's beautiful writing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The project that you're proposing, I think is summarized very well in that paragraph. But what does that mean? What does that mean for anybody who wants to wrestle, I guess, with Nietzsche?
Well, there's a certain way of taking the insights that we've been working with here and to sort of say, hey, you know what? We can either sidestep him. He's not an essential figure, or even worse. He's just a fake bourgeois rebel, or he's just, you're having your adolescent Nietzsche phase. Good for you. I think that it strengthens his cause. His cause is successful. We live in Nietzsche's world. He has performed certain victories, okay? And we should take him seriously. That's the first point. And what I'm trying to say is there's a way to enter into the community building project with this knowledge. it's kind of like not out but through means that, yeah, let's take the pill, the Nietzschean pill, and but with a certain immunity blocker, right? So take two pills. Take the Nietzsche pill with the immunity blocker, and go through, because perhaps, and this is the kind of big wager of the book, only by going through him do we fully understand how to create a world which he was opposed to, which ultimately we want. It's the same thing that Kurt Eisner, one of the first parasitical readers of Nietzsche, understood, which is there's something about this figure that is prophetic, and that he has declared something about contemporary capitalism that is highly sophisticated and reactionary and robust, and that we cannot understand it by being on the sidelines. We got to get on the inside. And another part of that also is that because Nietzsche is such a class-conscious thinker, we have to read him with that awareness as well. And when we don't, so we have to sort of read Nietzsche as an enemy in order to achieve the type of society that we want. In that sense, he's a necessary figure. He's a necessary figure. Whether that means at the end of the day we kind of look back and say, "Oh, we had defeated Nietzsche." I'm fine with that. But we have to engage him. That's the point.
Yeah.
Engage him in a new way.
Yeah. Well, it is a brilliant book. I think it's a brilliant project, as it were, as well. So when does your book come out? It's 9 January. Is that correct, or is it later than that? Do you remember?
It's actually the second.
Oh,
So
second.
right
Okay.
after the new year.
Great.
2024. September.
And this
Yeah.
should be going. This should be going live for everybody the week before that. So hopefully that will help people
Fabulous.
know about your book. I highly recommend it. Again, for anybody who is not sure if you have the, I guess, intellectual capacity, as it were. There's, it's something I've always been very critical of, is the way in which information or knowledge is kind of locked up within academic jargon, as it were.
Sure.
This book is not one of those, not at all. It's I found it highly accessible, and quite fascinating, and it might it might even be a good introduction to Nietzsche for those who have always wondered but have always had this kind of fear of his ideas. So the book is called How to Read Like a Parasite: Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, by Daniel Tutt. And I absolutely enjoyed this conversation, and I enjoyed reading your book too. Lots of fun.
Oh, it's been an honor and a blessing. I hope you have a great holiday if you are observing the holidays.
I observe
or
them
Great New Year.
all. I'm a pagan, so I observe that. But then I'm also living in a highly Catholic country, so I observe Christmas too. And probably,
Happy solstice to you.
Thank
as well.
you.
Hope that
Thank
went
you.
well. And would love to engage you on my program.
Yeah,
Talk
sure.
about your work.
Yeah.
And
Also,
that's something I intend to do.
if you have not read Dan Evans' book, I know I'm kind of a poor guy. Must think I have a crush on him or something. But his book, Nation of Shopkeepers, on the unstoppable rise of the new petite bourgeoisie, is really
Yes.
fascinating, and I feel like there is a really good dialogue to happen there, a really good conversation between your understanding of Nietzsche and his what I felt like really unveiling of what's happening with the petite bourgeoisie maintenant.
Yes.
Look at me, just went straight
Yes.
into French. So
Absolutely. I'm also going to be reaching out to Dan for
yeah, do it.
conversations.
He's a great guy. And yeah, so congratulations, and I hope all goes well with your initial launch and everything. I'm sure it's going to be a successful book. I'm sure it's going to be talked about a whole lot. If it isn't, then let's make sure that it is, because it's a really good book. So
Thank you so much, my friend.
yeah, well, thanks again, and thanks everybody for listening. And I will talk to you all soon. Thank you for listening to The Realign. I'm Reed Wildermuth. In this episode, I spoke with Daniel Tutt. Daniel is the author of How to Read Like a Parasite: Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. It will be released 2 January from Repeater Books. You can find out more about Daniel at his website. It's danieltutt.com. Tutt spelled with 2 T's at the end. You can support this podcast and my writing by going to read.substack.com. That's rhyd.substack.com. Thanks for listening.